Hello, everyone, and good afternoon to all. We would like to welcome you to the seventh installment of the Foundation for the National Interests Kwentong Mandaragat series on the origins of China in the South China Sea. This is brought to you in partnership with the University of the Philippines Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, with the support of the Asia Foundation and Amador Research Services. I'm Pia Benosa, one of the trustees of the FNI, and I'm currently joining you from Singapore. We welcome all of our distinguished guests here today, among them colleagues in government, members of the diplomatic corps, trustees and members of the FNI, professors and other colleagues in academe, and other civil society organizations. Good afternoon to all of you. As an administrative matter, we would like to advise everyone to turn off their audio and turn on their video if possible, so that we can keep a great atmosphere here of discussion and exchange. And later on, when we proceed to our plenary discussion, we can accommodate you to turn on your audios and pose your questions directly to our speakers. So, to give us some welcoming remarks, I would like to call on Ambassador Laura Q. Del Rosario, one of the trustees of the Foundation for the National Interest. Ma'am, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pia. Okay, my request somebody to please remove my photo. It's very distracting. Okay. All right. So anyway, I just want to welcome Dr. Bill Hayton to this webinar and also to welcome everybody. I see familiar names and faces among the attendees. So this is the seventh installment of the Kwentong Mandaragat, or the Tales of the Seafarers or Mariners webinar series, which will look closely at the origins of China's infamous Nine Dash Line claim with the renowned journalist and author of several books on Asia, namely The Invention of China, published in 2020, South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, published in 2014, and Vietnam, Rising Dragon, first published in 2010. Now, what is the relevance and importance of the webinar topic? For one thing, the Philippines is a party to the South China Sea disputes, and it has been at the forefront of the legal approach to managing the disputes. Even with the supposed clarity achieved with the arbitration ruling, the South China Sea disputes remain largely complex and highly uncertain. Evidently, the recent situation in Whitsun Reef, or the Julian Felipe Reef as we call it in the Philippines, and the subsequent exchange of statements from both the Philippines and Chinese officials demonstrate that the disputes are far from resolving. Continuous discussion on this matter is critical both for public discourse and policymaking efforts. Dr. Bill Hayton's work, South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, was instrumental in raising awareness and deepening understanding of this complex issue. Filipino scholars and practitioners, as well as the international community, truly benefited from this. His engagement with the Philippines in the past years is also notable. Between 2014 and 2015, Dr. Hayton delivered lectures that focused on history of the disputes and the emergence of modern Chinese nationalism. In 2015, Dr. Hayton tackled the South China Sea issue along the late Senator Roy Logores, a former national security advisor and the co-convener of the West Philippine Sea Coalition, in a forum hosted by the Foreign Service Institute. Dr. Hayton's presentation and discussion with participants came at a time when the Philippines was trying to navigate uncertain waters in the South China Sea and balance relations with Beijing. Now, how about what can we say about the future of regional security vis-a-vis China's claims? Although there are several claimant states in the South China Sea dispute, China is undoubtedly the only claimant that has the unilateral capability to alter the status quo. This is demonstrated with the artificial island building and the features it has occupied and its insistence on enforcing its own fishing regulations in the area. It is also moving closer down south, which raises the concern of other claimant states and the intention of China to maintain peace and stability in the region. Since 2013, China has at least one Coast Guard ship stationed near Luconia Shoals, which is off the coast of Malaysia's Sarawak state. Beijing has also claimed that Lithuania shoals are part of its national territory. Because China never shared the exact coordinates of its nine dash line, this ambiguity provides them with the flexibility to determine what it wants to claim as they see fit along the way. And of course, this ambiguity, even if it was resolved in the arbitral ruling, is largely what makes China's behaviors in the South China Sea uncertain. Therefore, its assertion and actions in relation to the South China Sea are a critical determinant of the future of regional security in Southeast Asia. What is the way forward? We hope to continue the conversation, problem solving discussions after this webinar. Perhaps after this, we'll have more questions than answers. But that's encouraging because we can examine what we know and discover the known unknown. Continue to join our Kwentong Mandaragat webinar series. Let's build a community where we can learn, problem solve, and work together. Our current situation is screaming collaboration. So let us heed that call, let us heed that scream. So I want to welcome again Dr. Hayton, and thank you very much. We hope to have a pleasant afternoon discussing with you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's a very kind, a very accurate introduction, I think, of the stakes and where we are right now. My thanks to the foundation, to Julio, and to everybody who's helped with the organization of this event. So I was going to talk for sort of about 40 minutes or so, which I think maybe should leave plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. I'm going to share my slides, if that's okay. Right. Can people see? So people can see that, can't they? That's fine. So just, I mean, I got into this topic after I had been a reporter in Vietnam and wrote a book about Vietnam. And I was looking for a topic for another study in 2011 when China's behavior in the South China Sea suddenly became newsworthy as far away as Europe, and that's sort of when I started to write about it in 2011. So I suppose this year is the 10th anniversary that I've been thinking and writing about the South China Sea. And it's a subject that doesn't let go. There's always more to find out. So I added it into the book that I've just published, which the ambassador kindly mentioned, The Invention of China. It's just one of the chapters in there, but it's really where I sort of started to examine the emergence of China's sense of territory and nation and so forth. So the book goes into earlier periods and wider subjects, but it comes back to where, for me, it all started on the South China Sea. I mean, I'm sure you're very familiar with this map. The only thing I'm going to point out here, if you're not familiar with it, is obviously you know the Paracels and the Spratlys down here, and you will know Scarborough Shoal here. But if you're not familiar with Pratas particularly, well, it's or sometimes known in Chinese as Dongsha, then it's up here. And although we don't pay too much attention to it at the moment, it's really where the South China Sea disputes began, I would argue. I would sort of simplify it, and I'm sure Jay would maybe tell me that I've oversimplified this. There are two basic sets of legal disputes in the South China Sea. There's the disputes over the rocks, and then there are disputes over the spaces in between the rocks. And I think in the past, there was much focus on the ownership of the rocks and reefs, but that seems to have sort of disappeared, really, because I think people just assume that it's too complicated to resolve. And much more attention has been focused on the maritime disputes. And that's because of the very smart legal case that the Philippines brought and won at the arbitral tribunal in 2016, which in theory at least settled the maritime disputes. You know, who can do what in the sea, who can fish, who can get the oil and gas, that sort of thing. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but more about the underlying territorial disputes and how China came to claim these various rocks and reefs. Now, if you go on the website of the Chinese embassy in Manila, you will find this document here. It's on the websites of many Chinese embassies and foreign ministries. And it's quite an old document, and it gathers together a whole load of bits and pieces of quotations from old documents and things, which appear to underpin an ancient and historic Chinese claim to the South China Sea. So there's a particular quote here, which you often see. There are islets in the South China Sea. The water is filled with magnetic rocks or stones, which is attributed to the Yiwuji, a very old document. And this is portrayed as demonstrating that a country called China claimed these islands back 2,000 years ago. However, if you go back and actually try and find an old copy of the Yiwuji, and we don't actually have the original because we have copies of copies, really, but we go back to the oldest one that we can find. And a guy called Johannes Kurtz, a German scholar who teaches at the University of Brunei Darussalam, has done this. And he goes and finds that actually, when you go and look at the old Chinese document, it doesn't say anything about the South China Sea at all. And when you add in the following sentence, it tells you that it's foreigners who are navigating through these rocks and reefs, not Chinese people. So actually, if you go and look at the original Chinese text, it undermines the Chinese claim. And so I treat these use of old documents with as we say, a pinch of salt, a very large pinch of salt. They are the result of people going back through old documents and trying to find anything which might justify a claim to islands. And this is a particular problem, I think. So I want to actually start in a more recent period. And I think really, although it's very hard to prove a negative, I think we can say that before the 20th century, there was minimal interest among Chinese authorities in the islands of the South China Sea, beyond the ones that you could actually see from the coast, really. And I would recommend this book by Ronald Poe, who's at the London School of Economics. He talks about how the Qing Empire, up until 1912, regarded these the sea and maritime boundaries. And he talks about this concept that there was sort of an inner sea and an outer sea in Qing thinking, and that the important bit was the outer sea was then subdivided into an inner sea and an outer inner sea, and the outer inner sea was sort of as far as the Qing were concerned, and that was basically the same kind of distance as a territorial sea, the kind of distance that you could see or you could patrol in a fairly small ship. They had no interest in areas beyond that. And a map published in 1897 showing Guangdong province shows no interest in any islands further south than Hainan, for example. So really, I would say that by the start of the 20th century, there is no sense of a territorial claim on any islands further away than could be seen from the mainland. Now, so where does China's claim? What is China's claim? I suppose is the question. And Jay, I'm sure, will have thought about this immensely more than I have. But just to summarize it, I mean, and since there's no official declaration of what China's claims are in the South China Sea, we rely on people who sort of speak, kind of for China in some ways in a kind of unofficial capacity. And Wu Shizun is of the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in Hainan, is one of the big voices on this. And he characterizes the Chinese claim as threefold: sovereignty over all of the features, sovereign rights as defined by UNCLOS, and you can kind of say, well, we agree with the basis on which China is making these claims, even if we don't agree, with the detail. The problem, of course, is that then he goes on to say that China enjoys certain historic rights that go beyond anything in UNCLOS, and that obviously is the major problem for the regional countries, including, of course, the Philippines. I would argue, and I've written about this, that the idea of historic rights in the South China Sea, that China enjoys rights to resources which go beyond UNCLOS can be traced back to one person, Professor Fu Quanchen, here on the left, who was actually in Taiwan, but is more nationalistic than the Chinese, even though he's on Taiwan. He left the Kuomintang because he thought the Kuomintang was going soft on one China policy. I would say that this one person has probably done more to cause conflict in the South China Sea than any other single person by inventing this concept of historic rights. He deserves the Nobel Anti-Peace Prize, if you ask me. Now teaches at Xiamen University. The other form of China's claim, and I think there's evidence that it's moving towards this, is to try and argue that that China is entitled to sort of UNCLOS type rights based on the fact that there are groups of islands together, so that even if individual islands aren't entitled to an exclusive economic zone, as the arbitral tribunal ruled, then perhaps groups of islands taken together might generate that a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which would actually be more area under Chinese administration than currently even the U-shaped line. I think legal scholars can debunk that. I won't go into much detail here, but this dates back, I think, this argument to the period around the arbitral tribunal ruling, when you started to see this idea emerging. And unfortunately, China has plenty of resources to pay institutes of maritime studies to spend time developing new legal arguments as to why they shouldn't just simply accept the UNCLOS wording and the arbitral tribunal, and that's an ongoing problem. So that would be the effect of a four-Shahs claim. This is a map drawn by by CSIS in Washington, but you can see, in effect, it simply finds another basis for perpetuating the problem. This slightly overlaps with what I think is emerging as another potential problem, which is whether China is actually going to claim underwater features in the South China Sea as territory. And this, I think, exposes the absurdity of some of the elements of the Chinese claim. So this is a little spot in the South China Sea known as the James Shoal, and you can see here there's a unit of Chinese sailors and Marines who are swearing loyalty to the Communist Party at the southernmost point of Chinese territory. But if you look carefully at this picture, you'll notice that there isn't actually any territory there, because this is the James Shoal, and the nearest territory is actually 22 meters below the surface of the sea. And the reason that China claims this piece of underwater territory was for me the origins of trying to understand the emergence of China's claim. And what I will say at this point is that the Chinese name for this feature, Zhengmu Ansha, is simply the transliteration of the English name James. So James becomes Zhengmu. And that was the clue that really got me started on investigating the emergence of the Chinese claim. So that's where the James Shoal is, right down the bottom end of the South China Sea here, close to Borneo. And here it is. This is the map that China sent to the UN Convention on the Limits of the Continental Shelf back in 2009, which you could say sort of restarted a lot of the concerns in Southeast Asia about China's actual intentions. And what's interesting, I think, and obviously the Philippines will understand this well, is that you're particularly concerned about the situation on and around the Reed Bank, an underwater feature. Malaysia is worried about the situation at James Shoal, Luconia Shoals down here. Vietnam has had clashes on the area of Vanguard Bank over here. And these are the areas around which the U-shaped or 9-dash line or 11-dash line was drawn. And this, on the right-hand side here, is the first map that I've discovered that actually shows the line in its sort of more or less its present form. And what you'll notice is you have these islands down here, which are named and coloured in, but these aren't actually islands. These are in fact underwater features. And so you can see the names appearing here. And they are the reason that the line was drawn in this way. But this map contains mistakes. As you can see, there's non-existent islands here. These islands do not actually exist, and yet they become the features around which the U-shaped line was drawn. And I'll go on to, and I'll come back and I'll explain how this happened. But my argument is that China has locked itself into confrontation with its neighbors on the basis of very bad maps and poor knowledge of the South China Sea during the early 20th century. When China drew up, so China's claim emerges in its present form for the first time, really, I would say, in 1948. And various people have traced this process, and I've added a little bit more to that story. I would recommend a paper or an article by Chris Chung from the University of Toronto in Canada, who has actually examined the minutes of the Republic of China meetings in 1945, 46, and 47, when they were deciding what to claim in the South China Sea. And at that point, Chris is clear, the minutes are only talking about claiming islands. So the point of the map that was published in 1948, and this line, this dashed line that appears on this map here on the right-hand side, was purely to indicate that China was making a claim to these islands on this side of the line, and not to, for example, Natuna on the other side of the line. It had nothing in it at that time about claiming historic rights or waters or anything like that. This is obviously a time well before UNCLOS rights as we know them. So we've got concrete proof that back in 1947, 48, China had no intention of claiming anything other than the various islands that it had drawn on the map. So the next question is, why did it come to draw the line in that particular way and to claim those particular islands? And right to the very end, this claim was being disputed even within the Chinese government. So, and here's the proof. The Chinese government during the Second World War produced a handbook to try to introduce China to its neighbors and allies in the rest of the world. It's quite a thick book. And on page 1, it defines the area of China. Where is China's territory? So in the edition that was published in 1943, on page 1, it says that the southernmost feature of the Chinese claim, the Chinese territory, is the Paracel Islands in the northern part of the South China Sea. Yet, by the time of the second edition, published in 1947, you'll see that the claim has now extended to what were then called the Tuansha Islands, which were then renamed the Nansha Islands, i.e. the Spratlys. And not only that, the book admits that these claims are contested among China, the Philippines, and Indochina, French Indochina as it was. So you can see in the 4 years between 43 and 47, the Chinese claim has expanded south by 600 miles or something from the Paracels to the Spratly Islands. So I think this is another clear piece of evidence that the Chinese claim to the Spratlys is very, very recent. In fact, I have said in the past that the Chinese claim to the Spratly Islands is younger than my parents. So how did we get here? So I would argue that the claim emerges over the course of 40 years between 1907 and 1947. And it emerges thanks to the intervention of a few key individuals. Gentleman called Li Jun, who was a general in the Qing armed forces and an administrator in the 1900s. Bai Mei Chu, a geographer, the guy who drew that wobbly map that I showed you. And then 2 of his students who go on to advise the Chinese government after the Second World War about the nature of its claims. So this is kind of where it all starts, really. And it starts with guano, bird droppings. Japanese merchants were very keen on guano to use as a fertilizer for the rice fields back in Japan. And they were very active in the South China Sea and in the Pacific in digging up mining guano and taking it back home. And in 1907, this became a massive issue because of the overall context between China and Japan at the time, the rise of nationalism in China, the revolutionary movements against the Qing Empire, and the general sense that the Qing government was not able to protect the country against the foreigners, whether they be British or French or, in this case, Japanese. And so it becomes a massive issue when a man called Nishizawa Yoshiji is discovered on Pratas Island in 1907, and then the Qing authorities want to try and prove that Pratas Island belongs to France, belongs to China, but they find it very difficult to do so, and so they set out a process of trying to look at old documents and to argue within the kind of the language of modern Western international law why Pratas Island should belong to China and not to Japan. And eventually they find a document which mentions it, and they use this. And because the Japanese government or businesses are under commercial pressure, there's a big boycott going on at the time. In 1909, the Japanese government concedes that if the Chinese side pays compensation, that they will give up their claim to Pratas Island. And so that becomes the very first place that China stakes a claim in the South China Sea. It's on Pratas Island in 1909. But in the context of doing that, Mr. Li Jun here also organizes an expedition to go to the Paracel Islands. Now, foreigners are much more familiar with the Paracels than Li Jun is or his colleagues, because, of course, they're sailing past them regularly on the way to Europe. But this is the sort of first time it would appear that Li Jun has even heard of the Paracel Islands. So he organizes an expedition in 1909 to go and claim them, and he turns it into a big publicity stunt, with coverage in the newspapers and the firing of cannon and the planting of flags and things to prove that this is now Chinese territory. So I would say at the first time China claims the Paracel Islands would be in 1909. But very rapidly, China loses interest in this. I mean, even as the revolution takes place in 1911, 1912, even before then, they've lost interest. They were hoping it was going to be a land of riches, but it turns out to be, no use unless you're interested in collecting bird droppings. And so the interest in the Paracels disappears. It starts to emerge again a bit later during the late 1920s, and it starts to become contested. The French start to take an interest, and the French make a claim to the Paracels in 1931, and then China starts to respond to that in 1932. So there's a France-China argument over the Paracels emerging in the early 1930s. But the next big step really is in 1933. So in 1933, what happens is that France formally publicizes a claim it has made to the Spratly Islands, not to the Paracels, but to the Spratly Islands. So there's a dispute taking place with the Chinese government over the Paracels, and separately, France goes and claims the Spratly Islands and announces the claim on Bastille Day, the big national holiday in France, 1933, and then publishes the details of the claims in the official newspaper about 10 days later, specifically naming 6 islands. Down the bottom, you'll see Titu, or Pagasa, as we know it in the Philippines, and some of the others. Now, what this does is it provokes a massive reaction in Chinese public opinion, and also massive confusion. So this is a document I got from Taiwan, and it's a copy of a telegram. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs had sent a request to other departments to tell us more about these islands that the French have claimed. And then this is the Republic of China Navy responding and saying, in fact, there are no islands here. There are no islands between the Philippines and Vietnam. So in 1933, the Chinese Navy was unaware of the existence of the Spratly Islands between Philippines and Vietnam. And in fact, it was only when the Chinese consul in Manila went to see the American Geographic Survey office in Manila and was given a map of the South China Sea that he was able to understand that the Spratly Islands were different from the Paracel Islands. And then he, Mr. Kwong, I think it was, telegrammed the Chinese government back in Nanjing to tell them this. And eventually the Chinese government comes to believe that the islands that the French have just claimed are not the same ones that China claimed back in 1909, and therefore decides not to protest against the French annexation of these islands. Unfortunately, however, our old friend Li Jun here, the former general, comes out of retirement and publishes a whole series of articles and gives interviews to journalists in sort of July, August of 1933, in which he tells the readers of all these newspapers that these islands that the French have just claimed are the same ones that he claimed back in 1909, that they are indisputably Chinese, and that the Chinese government needs to stand up and make its claim clear again. So he is responsible for confusing large parts of the Chinese population by mixing up the Paracels and the Spratlys. And the problem is that an awful lot of the academic literature takes its history from these newspaper articles that were published in 1933. And so really that's what I found I was doing in my research, was trying to find the sources of a lot of this inaccurate information and then to try and see what actually happened. And it comes back to these newspaper articles here from 1933. So at this point, what's happened in 1933 is confusion. The government understands the real situation, public opinion doesn't, and there's a sense that the Chinese claim should extend to the Spratly Islands, but doesn't. So what the government does, the Chinese government, is set up a committee to inspect maps, to try to clarify the locations and the names of various features, particularly in the South China Sea, and to give them Chinese names and to clarify exactly what China claims. Now, this is a page from a book published in 1988, but it shows how this committee went about doing it. And what they did was take the English names for these various features and then to translate or to transliterate them into Chinese names. And if you read Chinese here, you can see the 1935 column here. Most of these names are simply translations or transliterations of the English name. So Vanguard Bank down here, Chanwei Tan. Okay, Chanwei Tan. It's and James Shoal itself over here becomes Zhengmu Tan. Spratly Island becomes Sibala Tuo, which is simply the transliteration of Spratly Island, named after the English sailing captain Richard Spratly, and so on. So these are not obviously Chinese names. What happens subsequently in this map, this page shows it. In 1947, some of the features were given more Chinese-sounding names. So, for example, Luconia Shoals was originally transliterated as Lokang Nia, just simply the transliteration of Luconia. Luconia comes from Luzon. It's the sort of a different way of saying Luzon. But in 1947, the name was changed to Kang, which means health. So if you look at it now, it looks like it means health shoal, but in fact, it's just a contraction of Lokang Nia. And there are other examples here too. So Scarborough Reef was Scarborough, Sigala, anyway, it's the transliteration of Scarborough. In 1947, it becomes Minzuo, I think, the Democracy Reef. And then in 1983, the communists call it Yellow Rock, Huangyan. So this is how the names emerge. And the names are taken from British lists. The problem is that by translating shoal as tan, this committee introduced an error, because the word tan, this Chinese character here, it means sandbank, and a sandbank can be above water or below water. And so by calling it tan, they were suggesting to people that these underwater features, and James Shoal and Vanguard Bank or whatever, all underwater features, were suggesting that they might actually be islands. And this is why, when Bai Mei Chu, this geography professor, in 1936 decides to publish his own atlas of China, he takes these names literally. And here are these tans down here that we saw in the other map. There's Zhengmu Tan, here's Chanwei Tan, and this one here is Haima Tan, Seahorse Bank over here. And he draws them as islands. And then he draws his big red line, his national boundary around these underwater features. And you can see here, this is this part on the right is a small section of this much larger map of China. And he describes this this red line in the same way as he would have claimed to say Tibet or Xinjiang or Mongolia or whatever, a firm and definite claim. But this is actually a work of fiction. These islands do not exist. The only one I guess you could say is probably that one there, I think, is Scarborough Shoal, maybe. But this is the origins of so much of the confusion of the South China Sea today. This is Bai Mei Chu on the right here, and you can see I've translated some of the names here. Interestingly, the Nansha Chundao, the south group of islands archipelago, is this one here, up here. So today we're used to the Chinese referring to the Spratlys down here as the Nansha, but back then this was the Nansha because this was at the time, the southern area that the Chinese claimed. But of course, these islands, in fact, don't actually exist. This one, Double Island, that's a reference to Les Deux Îles, northwest, northeast and southwest Key down here. And here's Chanwei Tan, here's Zhengmu Tan, here's Haima Tan. So these are simply the English names translated or transliterated. Now, why did he choose these? Why did the committee choose these? Well, my theory, and I can't prove this, it's simply a theory, is that they copied a map, possibly this one, British map published in London in 1918. But you can see that James Shoal, Vanguard Bank, and Seahorse Bank are marked with little dotted lines around them. And I simply think that Bai Mei Chu misunderstood the meaning of these little dotted lines here, and he drew them as islands when in fact they are underwater features. So the Chinese claim to this part of the South China Sea is, I believe, simply the result of the misunderstanding of this map by a lonely geography professor back in 1936. Unfortunately, two of his students were then called upon to advise the Chinese government after the Second World War about what islands and features it should claim in the South China Sea. And these two gentlemen were both seconded to the ROC, Ministry of the Interior, and they drew up the map based on the claims. And then one of them, Zheng Ziyu, he actually took part in the expedition to Taiping Island, Itu Aba, which became known as Taiping Island. But even after that expedition, so that expedition was 46, there were arguments still going on within the Chinese government about whether or not to claim the Spratlys. As late as February 1947, the commander of that expedition was still arguing that the Spratlys were closer to the Philippines and that China shouldn't claim them. It was actually a ministerial meeting in April of 1947 that decided that the James Shoal should be the southernmost point of Chinese territory. And it did so based on the idea that this view had already spread among the population because of these newspaper articles earlier and everything else, and that it would be embarrassing not to claim that feature as the southernmost point of Chinese territory. So it was a whole series of mistakes, arguments, political calculations that led to a Chinese claim as far south as the James Shoal. So just to think about what this has caused today, the little sort of red stars that I've got there are the sites of the most intense disputes, I would say, in the South China Sea at the moment. If you were to remove those underwater features from the claim and just, for example, to draw a line around the above water islands and say, right, well, this is the disputed area here, the actual genuine islands, you would immediately remove 90% of the trouble in the South China Sea in terms of disputes over resources and whatever. So it's the way these maps were drawn, the claims to these underwater features that have created the problems that we have today. How would we resolve them? Well, I think there are precedents for how it can be done. If the various claimants could stop talking about claiming groups of islands, but started claiming individual features instead, then it would be possible to do what the International Court of Justice did in the Pedro Branca case between Malaysia and Singapore, where even islands or features, rocks as close as this, you can decide different ownership based on what's known about the history of which countries occupied and administered them. So the ICJ was able to say that, well, because Singapore had built a lighthouse and administered this one, this could belong to Singapore, whereas the other ones, there had been no challenge to Malaysia's claim. So even though they're very close together, it's possible to disaggregate them. And I think you could probably do the same thing with all of the features in the South China Sea, if you were to sort of build up a kind of matrix of, which state had actually demonstrated occupation and administration of the various different features, and it would be relatively easy, even without the participation of other governments to do this, because so many governments have been so active in putting their material into the public domain of late. And if any rich donor wants to fund my research project into this, I'm ready and waiting. One thing I will just say is that often you hear the Chinese side talk about the Cayo Declaration as having promised the Paracel and the Spratly Islands to China in 1943. But here is a text. Here is the text of the Cayo Declaration in 1943, and the one thing you'll notice is that the words Paracels and Spratlys don't appear at all. In fact, it says the Japanese, so certain territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, and it names them Manchuria, Formosa, Taiwan, obviously, and the pescadores shall be restored to the Republic of China. Full stop. There's then a new sentence which says Japan will also be expelled from the other territories which is taken by violence and greed. But it says nothing about which countries will then receive those islands, deliberately, in my view, because the French and the British also had imperial claims on some of these features at the time. And so therefore, this Cayo Declaration was careful not to allocate them to anybody else in particular. So that, I think, brings us to an end. There's obviously plenty more in the book, and I'm happy to take other questions that you may have. I shall leave it there. Hope that has been clear.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayton, for your new contribution on the discourse on the South China Sea maritime and territorial disputes. Having myself dabbled also on certain research on South China Sea issues, I can definitely see how valuable a resource this is going to be for researchers on the topic, as well as the decision makers, that some of whom we actually also have here today with us. So without further ado, I would like to invite for certain comments or reaction, Professor Charmaine Misalucha Willoughby, one of the trustees of the Foundation for the National Interest. Ma'am?
Thank you, Pia. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Hayton, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your insight. My remarks this afternoon will revolve around the consequences of China's invention of maritime claims that you have discussed at length, but also the consequences of how it invented itself and what that means for the rest of us. China is on everyone's minds these days, and with good reason. We may love it or hate it, but one thing is clear: it's a nebulous, ambiguous, mysterious jumble of identities, motives, and end goals tied up with our own emotions and passions and versions of patriotism. And this is precisely where I find Dr. Hayton's scholarship most fascinating. He writes, sir, in an almost lyrical form without compromising academic rigor. And that's something that most of us only aspire to do, but you have done it so very well. Dr. Hayton argues in his latest book that China's vision of the past and its role in history have been deftly woven together to create a cohesive entity. In other words, one way to unravel the mystery that is China is to see it as an quote unquote an invention. From this framing, it makes sense to trace the invention of China, sovereignty, the Han race, Chinese history, nation, language, the national territory, and its maritime claims in the South China Sea. Overall, reading Dr. Hayton's book leads me to identify three master narratives about China. The first is that China is a victim of foreign oppression and that it has played a minor role in its own self-determination. Here is where the Opium War, the decline of the Qing dynasty, and stories of the 100-year humiliation originate and thrive. Today, this trajectory still resonates and provides a justification for the strong role of the Chinese Communist Party in the domestic level. The second master narrative that I've been able to pick out from reading Dr. Hayton's scholarship is that the representation of China, the country, its civilization, its history are all timeless and monolithic. This is how China projects itself. This is the core of the Chinese identity, its Chineseness, which is articulated in language and epitomized by the crucial role of the Han race. This also becomes the basis for China's affinity with overseas Chinese communities in different parts of the world. Likewise, the core function of the claim to timelessness is to support the Chinese nation state and spatially defined sovereignty. The third master narrative encapsulates ideas like mandate from heaven and the subtle difference between Zhongguo and Zhonghua. These point to China's centrality in this almost religious cosmology, as well as its rightful place in it. This demonstrates no less that the invention of nations and states is highly political and a consequence of careful and deliberate choices made in the past. These narratives prop this even grander rhetorical vision of a quote-unquote common destiny, seen by many as moves to entrench Xi Jinping and the CCP's legitimacy. Now, while the argument that nations and states are social constructs may not necessarily be new, Dr. Hayton posits that China's uniqueness is twofold. It is both an invention of the West, but at the same time, it is also a Chinese construct. China managed to adopt concepts from the outside world, adapted them to suit specific circumstances and contexts, and presented hybridized notions of self and other. The question that now emerges becomes, is this the story that China tells itself? Or is this the story that we, as outsiders, tell about China? If it is the former, then it provides an answer to the kind of country that China will become. In other words, if this narrative is China's self-image, then it illuminates not just the country's motivations, but also its future trajectory. As such, the international community can adjust, accommodate, or push back as needed. This, however, begs several questions. Is this the narrative of China, the CCP, or Xi Jinping? How internalized is the narrative in the domestic level? And equally important, how sustainable is this rhetoric or is this narrative in a potential post-Xi era? If, on the other hand, this is a story that we tell about China, then it is more revealing of who we are as outsiders looking in than a reflection of the object of our perception. Scholars often posit that the Chinese worldview contrasts sharply with the rest of the world. But this juncture, I think, is superficial at best. China's invention, or perhaps more accurately, its reinvention of itself and the way it jealously guards its sovereignty is indicative not of trumping the game, but instead of conformity with the Westphalian foundations of the international system. Ironically, Westphalia is another invention, another myth that is imposed on all states. The shift from the pre to the post 1648 birth, post 1648 international system did not happen overnight. It is the changes have been incremental, and the birth of the modern state system that we know today has been a long and painful and incomplete process. An argument can then be made that China, in its current form, is still going through the process and is displaying how it is consolidating or fulfilling its Westphalian identity. By no means is this or should this be seen as a defense of China. Rather, this serves more as a critique of the problematic notions of a state-based international system. Dr. Hayton effectively draws our attention to these issues, that nations and states do indeed stand on arbitrary and yes, invented foundations, and that even the Westphalian tradition to which we hold China and everybody else accountable is both historically and contextually contingent. Let me stop here, as I'm sure our audience would also like to share their views. Thank you so much again, Dr. Hayton. Back to you, Tia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Willoughby. And together with the earlier presentation, I think we have a lot of food for thought to jumpstart the discussions. So actually, at this point, I would like to invite the audience to either submit their questions through the chat box or send it privately to me, or use the raise hand function to make their interventions before the whole group. Are there any questions to get us started? Or maybe we can invite Dr. Hayton to react a bit to what Professor Willoughby has said.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Willoughby. That's a really smart, I think, dissection of the main ideas in the book. I mean, I think I'm particularly interested in this recognition of the hybrid construction of identity. The way that China thinks about itself today is, as you say, is a function of a mixing of foreign ideas and domestic ideas. And really, I think that's what made the Chinese Revolution in 1911, 1912 successful, because it was engineered by people who were mainly based outside the country in terms of the ideas that motivated it. They were based in Japan, and Sun Yat-sen grew up for part of his life in Hawaii and studied in Hong Kong. You had people based in Southeast Asia and North America, and they were looking back at their country not as people who had sort of grown up and had a sort of village point of view, but for people who recognized or saw their country as one country in a global system, in this Westphalian system, and they were trying to take bits of what they had grown up being taught, their understanding of what it meant to be Chinese and whatever, and to put it into a new context, into this sort of context of an international state system. And all the rest of it. And if you're going to define a state, you then have to define who lives in the state. You've got to put boundaries around it. You've got to justify those boundaries. You need a sense of history and all the rest of it. And so this period of the 1900s was absolutely critical for these arguments about how to answer all of these questions, and how to draw lines, really, to put some people inside the state and the nation and some people outside it. And China isn't alone in that process. I mean, pretty much every modern state has had to go through that. With a boundary, you have to sort of come up with lines. Where does one country begin and another country end? What about groups that consider themselves straddling boundaries? All these kind of things have been very difficult questions. And just as China claims a century of humiliation. Well, in Europe, we had a century of terror and war from sort of 1848 to 1945, as these arguments about nation and state, led to genocide in some cases and war in other cases. So China is not unique in this process. I think what is special about the maritime claim is that, in contrast to the land, where you set a boundary and another state pushes back, and sometimes that leads to friction and to war, but eventually might lead to a settled boundary. And China's hugely long land boundaries are almost entirely settled, with the obvious exception of the parts of the Indian Himalayas. Yet on its maritime boundaries, because of the nature of the sea and the fact that you can't maintain a constant presence there, its ideas of its maritime boundaries were never resolved, because other countries were sort of making their own claims and there was no final resolution. So you had this sort of contrast where the land claims are more or less fully settled, and yet it's the maritime claims now which are the ones which cause so much friction. And so I think trying to resolve those is this big contribution towards regional peace and stability. But it's very hard to do so when countries have sort of modeled or kind of based their identity on this sort of sense that every single rock and reef has to belong to us, otherwise we are still within the century of humiliation. This I think is the fundamental problem with trying to resolve the South China Sea disputes.
Thank you, Dr. Hayton. So we have received a question, actually two questions. One is related to what you were just discussing now, but we'll proceed to listen into the question posed on the chat box first, from Philip Roskamp. Actually, Philip, do you mind if we ask you to unmute and share with us some thoughts on the issue, in addition to what's on the chat box?
Well, I'm here. I'm here because I don't have any thoughts. I'm here to learn the thoughts, Pia. But But yeah. Anyway, the question in the chat box. I mean, I really found the point that you made, Dr. Hayton, on historic rights interesting, and just curious if, as a line of legal argumentation, or maybe even more broadly as a legal principle, is that something that you see PRC and argue their claims?
I think, well, the good and the bad side of China having a line around its claims is that the line is a problem, but the line, I think, also limits China's future claims. I don't see evidence yet of China trying to expand its line and claim, use any of these historic rights type arguments elsewhere. Even on land boundaries, you don't see yet, as far as I'm aware, any sense of wanting to kind of undo the territorial boundaries that it's agreed with, say, Russia or Korea or Afghanistan. And nor do you see an attempt to try and sort of expand the U-shaped line itself in the South China Sea. So I think the historic rights
it's 9 hours.
Element is kind of, it only really applies, I guess, within that U-shaped line. And so that's the kind of good news, I suppose. The bad news is that the line has obviously acquired a kind of quasi, religious, sentiment. I mean, it's easy to demolish, of course. I mean, if you're trying to say, okay, so you're arguing that China enjoyed some kind of rights within that line, okay, and you've drawn a line. Okay, so how are you going to prove that China didn't enjoy historic rights on the other side of the line? why is the line there? Did sort of somehow these ancient fishermen suddenly stop fishing at this point and say, on the other side of this line, we no longer we don't go, we don't have any rights to go there. But of course not. The only reason that line exists is because of that committee that drew it in 1947. It has no meaning beyond that. And the reason that committee drew that line in that shape was because of Professor Bai Mei-chu drawing it in 1936. So it's nothing to do with ancient or historic rights. It's purely arbitrary.
Oh, thank you.
We have another question from Professor J. Batangbakal on the chat box as well. On your thoughts, at what point in time did China essentially expand its claims from islands to historic waters? And exactly how did Fu Quanchen make that argument, so much so that it has been officially adopted by Beijing?
It's a good question. I wrote an article in Asian Affairs when I tried to sort of trace the emergence of the claim. And it's the sort of late 1980s, early 1990s that it starts to appear. And it appears in Taiwan, and it's part of arguments between within the Kuomintang party over whether to continue to maintain a one China policy, that Taiwan is, part of China and must be reunified as soon as possible. And the other sort of more autonomy, sort of separate, but two countries, one country, two systems position. And Fu Quanchen left the Kuomintang to join the new party in order to defend the sort of the much closer alignment with the mainland, if you like. And as part of these arguments, he started to develop these claims of historic rights in the South China Sea in historic waters. And there's a couple of others whose names are in the article. And they are sort of academics, but also politicians. They stand for election, and this becomes a sort of nationalistic sort of rallying point in the early 1990s, before it is eventually discounted and dropped. And then Fu Quanchen goes off to, I think, to Xiamen University at that point in the PRC. And advocates his ideas there, whereupon they are included in China's exclusive economic zone law of 1996, 98. And so unfortunately, his wording about historic rights becomes legalized, put into the Chinese law, in this EEZ law, as a result of his sort of made up version of history, and so it's unfortunately kind of got locked into Chinese law there, based on, I would argue, the views of fewer than 5 people in Taiwan in the late 1980s.
Thank you, Dr. Hayton. So we actually have a couple of questions on the chat box now. One of them is about China calling itself essentially as a maritime nation. So if you have any thoughts about that. And on a related note, another question that was sent in anonymously was how China has been getting other members of the international community to justify or to advance its South China Sea claims. What are its strategies? You have mentioned earlier something about the academic literature being used to support some of these claims. So if there are other modes that you have noticed, maybe it's good to discuss some of those now.
Okay, thank you. Maritime nation, it's interesting. I mean, as somebody who's interested in the history of this, I mean, I definitely want to acknowledge and emphasize the role played by fishermen, fishing communities and traders from the southern Chinese coast clearly in trade, obviously, connections with the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia and beyond. There's a book coming out, I'm forgetting its name, which might even be something like Maritime Nation or something, which specifically focuses on the Teochew, the people from Chaozhou in China, in Guangdong, who obviously traveled around and formed their own communities in different parts of Southeast Asia. I mean, if you look at how these groups traveled around Southeast Asia, people from Fujian, people from Guangzhou, and other areas. But then when they get to places like Vietnam, and maybe it's the case in the Philippines too, they set up sort of mutual help societies as Teochews or Cantonese or Hakka people. And they have an identity which is locked in those names, where their home villages, home regions are. It's only later that they are given the label Chinese as a result of things that happened back in China. Before then, they see themselves as separate, with their own separate organizations. And so to call China a maritime nation, I think overstates this. What you have is coastal communities that were connected to the sea and connected to areas beyond the sea. And a lot of the times they were connected in ways that the central state didn't like, because it saw them as smugglers or bringing foreign influences into the country, or in some way undermining the security of the land-based state. So China has not been a maritime nation, but it has had, the territory of China has had, places on it which have had very strong maritime connections, but they aren't always, official connections. Sometimes they're pirates, sometimes they are separatists, often they're smugglers. And often the central state tries to squash them. It's good that they're being rediscovered, this history, but it's got to be put in the right way, that these are not some agents of Chinese sovereignty. In fact, very often it was the opposite. They were undermining what the central government in Beijing or wherever thought was necessary for defense and things. Now, the second question about how China is getting other members of the international community to support its claims. Well, sometimes you have instances where countries far away are invited to sign or sign up to some kind of joint statement or something, which maybe casts doubt on the applicability of the Philippines' arbitral ruling or something like that. I mean, if you're a country in, I don't know, Chile or Southern Africa or something, maybe you don't really understand all the ins and outs of that, and people will sometimes sign up to things they don't fully understand. So that can be a problem. But then you've also got other ways. I mean, China has huge amounts of resources. The China ASEAN Maritime Cooperation Fund was announced with a sort of budget of $500 million, if I recall, about 6 or 7 years ago. Obviously, that's very tempting for universities and other foundations to work with. And so I think they have to be quite careful about whether that's endorsing China's view of international law and all the rest of it. So it's obviously the Philippines and Vietnam, for example, you have differences over maritime and territorial claims, but there's a sort of sense that your two countries are kind of evenly positioned on the scales of international relations, perhaps. Whereas in your dealings with China, obviously there's the concern, I think, that such a big country with much greater resources can simply roll over smaller countries, and I think China's using its economic weight a lot to try and bring people onto its side, and that's quite a hard struggle to resist, I think.
Thank you. Ambassador Bert Asuka actually has an intervention in the chat box that is very related to your last point on, on using military weight to basically to boss other smaller powers around. So maybe we can hear from Ambassador Asuka.
I got it. Well, thank you very much, Bia, for that. I thought that you just read the question at the chat box, but anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Hayton, for the presentation. Give us a new perspective on the narrative of China. When you were presenting that, I was recalling during my time when we were handling this issue on the West Philippine Sea in the DFA, we read a paper. It's actually a white paper of retired military officers on their strategic objective in the South China Sea, and this gives some justification of the island building scheme. But I don't want to go to that because it's quite an extensive white paper. But the point is, this narrative that you have, the Chinese have been foisting on the international community, especially in the South China Sea. In what context should we be looking at this? Surely I don't see it just a mere narrative bullying or a foisting this narrative on us. There must be a purpose, a strategic purpose for this. And I'm thinking in that context that they're just using this platform in order to advance their strategic interest in the South China Sea and putting it farther away from their own backyard into the Pacific Ocean. So I'd like to get your views on that, because we hear a lot of historical perspective on the South China Sea from the point of view of China, but what is really the ultimate objective for this? We can create our own narrative, but certainly when we create a narrative, there is a purpose behind it. And I think that's the reason for it. I don't know if you could share your views on this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. A very smart question. And I appreciate your collection of maps behind you there. That looks fascinating. I agree. I mean, so I think China does have strategic objectives, but it also, I think, is locked into a sort of a nationalist narrative, and the two are related, but it's interesting to think how they also contradict one another, perhaps, as well. And so, I mean, China, as we're all aware, has created these 7 very large, capable bases in the Spratlys. With runways and radar systems and all the rest. So the question is, does it really need an 8th? Does it need any more bases, or is its position in the southern part of the South China Sea secure now? Because if it doesn't need any more bases, wouldn't it just be so much better for China to say, okay, let's compromise on the territorial claims. You accept that our bases are there. We accept that you occupy the other islands, and we can carry on. We can living together, and we can sort of de-escalate the situation. But China isn't willing to do that. Why is it? Partly, we assume that it wants to take over the Scarborough Shoal because maybe that would improve its strategic situation in the eastern part of the South China Sea. But in other areas of the Spratlys, why is it so keen to keep on doing it? I mean, it could be that it's to do with how China hides its ballistic missile submarines, and it feels that it needs to control every single feature so that the US or Japan or Taiwan or Vietnam, can't have any access to the sort of central part of the South China Sea, and that China can then hide its submarines in there much more effectively. That might be the explanation. But I think there's actually something in the territorial narrative that China is basically saying, our country is not fully rejuvenated. This phrase from Xi Jinping, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That rejuvenation will not be complete until every single rock and reef within the U-shaped line is under Chinese sovereignty, just as Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, will have to be returned to the motherland in the same way. So I think there's a nationalistic narrative which parallels the strategic one, and they support each other. At the same time, I think there are other lobbies in China. So the fishing lobby, the maritime militia lobby, and whatever. They also lobby for resources, and they use the national argument to say, we are here to defend our national interests and our patriotism and all the rest of it. So I think there's an interrelation between the strategic and the material to do with the resources and the nationalistic element as well. And I don't really understand at the moment which is the most important, or whether they all help to reinforce the other one. I mean, I said from time to time, even to Chinese audiences, do you understand that by pressing your South China Sea claim in this way, you are undermining China's overall strategic interests? I mean, wouldn't it be so much better to have friendlier relations with the countries of Southeast Asia? And I don't get a response to it. It's sort of as if you can't question that nationalistic agenda, even though from my foreign Western perspective, it would be much more rational for China to compromise on its territorial claims, and for everybody in Southeast Asia to go, oh, you know what, China's a much better friend, than, for example, the United States, and perhaps we should all just sort of get along happily and give them more contracts to build railway systems or whatever. But by pursuing the South China Sea claim so aggressively, it's a sort of marker of everybody else's, or it's a reason why everybody else feels so suspicious about China's overall intentions. So it's a great question, and I can't give you a definite answer, but I think it's more than just the strategic side alone.
Thank you, Dr. Hayton. I'm afraid at this point we can only really speculate as to the intentions of China in the region. So, but it's good to have all of these different perspectives on this very, very vital question. We actually have two very related questions anonymously sent on how exactly do we move forward with the issues. First, how do we socialize China to the currently established international law? And on the other hand, are their claims actually so solid that there could be no room for negotiation? Or if there is room for negotiation, what should be our starting point?
That's a good question. I mean, there's obviously more than just China, or the dispute with China in the South China Sea. I mean, Philippines obviously has disputes with its other neighbors too. I mean, I'm not going to start talking about Sabah here, because that's a whole other issue. But if we're going to, China and Vietnam, for example, so the Philippines and Vietnam, for example, also have overlapping territorial claims. Now, how likely is it that China and Vietnam? China. I'm obsessed with China. How likely is it that the Philippines and Vietnam, for example, could reach some kind of consensus that you're not going to challenge one another's territorial claims in the South China Sea? It's easy for me to say because I'm not emotionally invested on either side. But if the countries of Southeast Asia could start to sort of de-escalate their claims, reach a kind of de facto understanding, then maybe it makes it easier to present China with a sort of united front, a united view on that. And that would start to sort of set the ball rolling in that. If you have, I mean, my general feeling is that, with a few exceptions, and for example, the Vietnamese takeover of Southwest Key in the 1970s from the Philippines is one of those exceptions. The pattern of occupation that you see now, which country has forces on which island, is the only one that has ever really existed. The other one, of course, which has changed, is the Western paracels between China and Vietnam. And there were some, during the 70s and 80s, there were little sort of exchanges, when Malaysia would build a monument on an island and the Vietnamese would come and blow it up and that sort of thing. But we're past that now. So could the countries of Southeast Asia reach some kind of settlement among themselves that they recognize each other's claims? So that would put, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, get the Indonesians involved as well, even though they're not territorial claimants, just to all say, okay, we recognize everybody else's existing holdings, and that's that. And then that presents China with a fait accompli, perhaps. and a means to resolve, or to talk about resolving it. So, are you would the Philippines be willing to recognize, China's claims on, Subi Reef or something like, Fiery Cross Reef? Obviously, Mischief Reef becomes a bit of an issue because it's a reef within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So there are, I'm not saying that's a simple thing. And of course, the position of Taiwan, is it part of China or not, is also part of a big wrinkle. I would say. I'm not going to pretend this is easy by any means, but then, you do pay diplomats for a reason, so that, and lawyers, so they can work that one out. Obviously, the Philippines won a great victory, I think, for humanity in 2016. A logical position. Interesting, though, that of course some big powers, even regional, medium-sized powers like the UK, have a slightly ambivalent attitude towards it. The recent, I think it was September last year, the British government put out a statement basically saying, we support the arbitral tribunal in the South China Sea, but left open because we have various uninhabited islands in the South Atlantic and elsewhere that we claim exclusive economic zones from. And we don't necessarily, as the UK, want the same principle to apply to our exclusive economic zones in the South Atlantic. However, there's still plenty, people and countries who wish to support the status quo and peace and stability in the South China Sea. So, they're all there, but ready to help. I don't know what you think about the impending arrival of the British aircraft carrier and its ships, which is sailing towards you. It's supposed to be a contribution to peace and stability in the region and to show that we care. And it's a sign that lots of us are concerned that if international law starts to erode in the South China Sea, it starts to erode everywhere. And we have our own problems in the Mediterranean with Turkey doing China and sort of drawing lines in the sea as well. So we're concerned that we stand, that the line is held around the world. So I think, there's lots of willingness from other countries to support the Southeast Asian countries to defend the rule of law, just so long as your government asks us. And if you don't ask us, then we aren't going to be in a position to assist. And I think, constant dialogue. Can you have discussions with your Chinese counterparts to talk about this historical evidence, kind of push back a little bit on these things? Why is China not joining the Southeast Asian Fisheries Development Council in Bangkok, whereas a country like Japan has joined it? Why is it not willing to join regional kind of cooperation agreements, right? And insists on setting up its own fisheries, cooperation center in Guangzhou, I think. It's time, I think, to call China out on this. If it really does believe in these sort of regional cooperation things, then go for it. There's an impending fish crisis in the South China Sea. Something has to be done about it. So I think all of these things are things that we can socialize China with a bit. Although, one has to admit, I think that with, somebody who has a limited understanding of history or has a particularly sort of nationalistic understanding like Xi Jinping, it's always going to be difficult. But I hope that with some of this historical evidence, you might be able to, all of you, push back when people start to say silly and unjustifiable things.
Thank you, Dr. Hayton. I don't see any other hands raised. So perhaps in the last 5 minutes before we close, I just ask my own question. Do you think that there is a perception in the international community of the Philippines actually sleeping on its rights because of the way it hasn't made use of its victory, its gains from the arbitration? And if there is such a perception, how do we move forward from that?
Okay, this is my perspective from several thousand miles away, and you can disagree with me, but I think there's a perception in Southeast Asia, and then I think it then goes beyond that. Is that which Philippines are we dealing with? during the time of President Ramos, you had a regional approach to the mischief reef crisis, and ASEAN came together. And as Jay Batong has reminded us, this was it June or July is the 25th anniversary of the start of talks that led to the whole COC process, which 25 years later we're still talking about it. So there was a kind of a sense that we want the region to stand together to push back, and then there's a change of government, and President Arroyo comes in, and it's Philippines alone, and then President Aquino gets in, and we're back to regional. Everyone's got to stand together to fight China. And then President Duterte gets elected, and no, we're back to the Philippines standing alone again. Okay, so what Southeast Asian countries going to go? Well, why are we going to stand up for you when in 3 years' time you're going to kind of go unilateral on us? So I guess that's the problem that Southeast Asian countries maybe worry about, and then other countries will be also cautious about backing the Philippines too much, I think, on this. The other problem, of course, is that I think the Americans in particular, I guess, are wary about being dragged into fighting the Philippines battles for it. And I think there was an attempt by the Aquino government to try to get the Americans to take, to be at the forefront of the Philippines dispute with China. And obviously the Americans were reluctant to do that. So, yeah, I mean, a kind of a sense of a consistent policy would be would obviously make everybody else feel much easier about supporting the Philippines. But I guess everyone's making their own calculations about their relationships with China at the moment, and it's a hot issue in the EU at the moment. As to how to balance the whole trade versus security worries, and of course that's happening everywhere. It's obviously more intense even in Southeast Asia. So I'm not saying these are easy issues, but I think more and more of us are certainly in the West are taking an interest and becoming concerned. There's a slight danger that we're kind of developing a slightly cartoon vision of China as a baddie in quite a few Western countries, and we're not sort of subtle enough in our approach, and so that possibly leads us to kind of oversimplify, what the situation is in Southeast Asia, and you'll once again, I imagine, be encountering foreigners who are telling you that you have to stand up to China and all this kind of stuff, and not really appreciating the kind of the subtlety of the situation that most Southeast Asian countries find themselves in. So it's it's going to be another tricky battle. But I see the Duterte administration is doing what other previous administrations have done, starting off, trying to be as friendly as possible to China, and then discovering that China doesn't necessarily respond in a friendly way. And then towards the end of their term in office, they suddenly think, okay, it's time to stand up. And I see a change in rhetoric coming from the government, and clearly a response to recent events and some kind of sense of frustration, I imagine. But we'll see. What will the next administration do in a year's time? Will it start off on the same learning curve, or will it sort of, will we go back to the other position in Philippines politics? It's up to your people.
Right, and it depends if we get a repeat of, the same roster of people for the next.
So could you? We could have Duterte president and vice president. Could we daughter as president and father as vice president? Is that my understanding? That's what we're looking forward to next year.
Apparently, that's in the cards. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Hayton, for sharing with us your expertise and the new product of your research on the region. We are very grateful to have, first of all, that your book was published in 2020 despite everything. We look forward to reading physical copies of the book in the coming weeks. And I'd also like to thank the other organizers and our trustees, Dr. Willoughby and Ambassador Del Rosario, who have shared their remarks on during our session today. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or your early afternoon for Dr. Hayton in the UK. We wish you a great remainder of April. Tomorrow is Labor Day. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to having you at our the next installment of the Kwentong Mandaragat series by FNI.